Focus on before and after your service. Brought to you by Sight Loss Friendly Church from Torch Trust.
Hello everyone, welcome to the second of our Focus On training sessions. My name's Matthew Horspool, I'm the Sight Loss Friendly Church advisor at Torch Trust, and with me is Becky Davis, who is the Sight Loss Friendly Church coordinator at Torch Trust.
Hi everyone, welcome.
So today's session is going to be talking about before and after your service. In practice, we're talking about welcome time and we're talking about fellowship. And this is in many ways the most important aspect of being sight loss friendly. Remember that we're talking about sight loss friendly, not sight loss ready or sight loss equipped or anything like this. And a lot of people get very hung up when we talk about Sight Loss Friendly Church about Braille and large print and guide dogs and canes and steps and, oh, our building isn't very blind friendly and all of this sort of thing. And all of these issues may or may not be important, but the most important of all is that blind people and people with sight loss feel welcome and valued and respected and a real, part of the community, appreciated for what they bring to the church. Not felt, they don't want to feel like a charity case or anything like that. Ultimately, people with sight loss are people, just like everybody else. And if the only thing you do as a sight loss friendly church is to make them feel welcome, then everything else will fall into place because you will establish what they need. And by making them welcome, you'll be able to work out, where to go from here. And maybe after that you will need to produce some Braille. But it's more important on day one that the welcome is in place than it is that the Braille is in place, because it's all well and good having Braille. What's the point of that if the welcome team doesn't identify that the Braille is necessary? So we're going to cover in this session a summary of the problem, strategies for identifying people with sight loss in the first place, how to introduce yourself, how to identify the needs of people with sight loss, making people with sight loss feel welcome generally, and including people with sight loss in fellowship after the service. So I'm now going to, Becky stopped sharing, that's brilliant. I'm now going to share a video with you. I'm going to share the first half of the video with you. It's quite an old video from Torch Trust, and some of it's not relevant anymore, so it will stop quite suddenly. But this video is a very good summary. It's a number of blind and partially sighted people talking about their experience of church and what it's like to be a blind and partially sighted person in church.
Coming into a new church is quite difficult just because it's an unfamiliar setting. One of the most difficult problems is actually getting to the church in the first place.
One of the most difficult things I find about church, and indeed in other places, is finding people I want to talk to, because of course I can't make eye contact with people.
I can't recognise people very often, and because I'm hearing impaired as well, I can't recognise voices, so I find getting to know people very difficult.
It's not very nice if you're sitting there or standing there just trying to discern from the noises around you what everyone else is doing.
With the worship, and it can get very confusing sometimes, because in some churches things change very quickly and you get confused.
But of course the main thing is being able to participate in worship when all the music is up on screens, or even if actually it's in hymn books. It's not much good to us as blind people. In participating in worship for us, we need to have the words of the songs that are being sung. We're quite good on our feet at learning songs and memorising them, but there's nothing like having the words.
I think when it comes to the sermon, I possibly find it easier because you have to listen a lot more, probably, to what people are saying. So I don't think that really is such a problem. I think the main thing people would want in church is the same as what sighted people would want, and that is to feel accepted and part of the body, and not just someone who has to be helped. You don't want to be thought of in terms as the person we've got to help all the time. It's just lovely to feel real love and real relationship. Just to be accepted as a part of the body, as a person, is just so important, and it makes all the difference in the world.
So that's given you some idea of the problem. Hopefully you could all see that and hear it. It's now going to turn over to Becky to talk about how to identify people with sight loss.
Oh, thank you very much, Matthew. I'm just going to remove your pin, if that's all right. There we go. We're going to be thinking about identifying people with sight loss. I'm just going to share a slide with you now as well. There are obviously sometimes some obvious identifiers, so we're just going to talk about them briefly. First of all, guide dogs. We all know some people that are blind or partially sighted do have a guide dog. It's worth noting that it's not just totally blind people that have a guide dog. A significant proportion of guide dog owners do have some degree of useful vision. So it doesn't mean that somebody is totally blind. It's probably more common for a long cane user to be someone with little or no vision, although some partially sighted people also do use a long cane. If a long cane has red stripes on it, this may indicate deaf blindness, whether that's total or partial. And also you may notice somebody carrying a shorter cane, which is called a symbol cane. And sometimes also ladies might attach a symbol cane to their handbag. So this is particularly used by people who are partially sighted. So there's some sort of more obvious visual identifiers that might help you identify somebody with sight loss. If a person with sight loss is accompanied by a sighted person, then you may also notice that they're being guided. That might be through by their elbow, or it might be in another way as well. And some people with sight loss may also alert you that they are going to be coming to your church in advance. So they may well phone up the church and let you know. And it's a good idea to therefore, when you have a conversation with them, find out how you might be able to identify them when they do arrive. And also make sure the welcome team and those that may be on the door are aware that conversation has taken place and know that there is somebody to be expected to come. So in other cases, it may be more difficult to know whether somebody has got sight loss or not. And you may only notice that they have sight loss later on. So if somebody doesn't inform you that they have sight loss, but you do become aware of it, don't draw attention to that fact, and don't sort of dwell on an apology that you haven't noticed, but maybe just talk to them quietly and say there's something that you have noticed, and ask them if there's anything that you can do to help. Some other signs that you might want to look for, or you might help you to become aware of people in the congregation. They might be slow or tentative walking, and where there is no other signs of infirmity, so they might be very carefully lifting their feet. They might have a lack of attention to features that are visually stimulating, so that might be notice boards or stained glass, whatever it is in your church. You might notice a lack of eye contact. There might be a clumsiness, so maybe when they're taking things from you or when they're sitting down, you may notice that. You also might notice prolonged squinting or holding printed material very close to their face. You might also see them holding printed material upside down, or maybe hymn books on the wrong page. And they might not always follow the movements of others. For example, they might not necessarily notice when people are standing or sitting during the service. So all these things might signify that somebody has sight loss, but you obviously shouldn't make assumptions either. So the next part is about introducing yourself. So really important to say your name when you talk to somebody, and hopefully you do that when you meet somebody, but particularly important for people who are blind or partially sighted to always say who's speaking, even if it's somebody that you've met before. So start the conversation with your name and also ask them what their name is. So always address the person by name whenever you return to speaking to them, because they might not necessarily recognize your voice straight away. And sometimes, obviously, people that know you very well may gradually come to recognize your voice. But it's still difficult to hear different voices when, especially in a big building where there's lots of people talking. So it's really important to always use your name when you're talking to somebody. If a person is accompanied by somebody with sight loss, address the person with sight loss directly. Don't talk sort of to the sighted person through them or about them, unless, of course, it is that you want to talk to the sighted person. And don't automatically assume that the sighted person that has come with them knows them or wants to be staying at the service, whatever's happening. It may be that it's the taxi driver that's dropped them off, or it might be somebody that they've met very helpfully outside who has offered to guide them up to the church. We're going to, and also we're obviously aware some people will bring a guide dog with them, and there is some guide dog etiquette to be aware of. We've got a short video from Guide Dogs UK, which just shows and talks about some of the useful things to be aware of with guide dogs. So we're going to watch this now.
We always want people to ask before they touch our dogs, no matter what stage the dog is in training, whether it's a puppy or whether it's a qualified dog. You just don't know what the person with the dog might be doing at that point, and even though it's a puppy and it's not in harness and working, it could be doing some crucial training work, and by going in and distracting and saying hello to the dog, it could ruin what the trainer's potentially doing. So we always say, always ask the handler first, is it okay to say hello to the dog? Obviously, if the handler says yes, then go ahead. So when they are qualified guide dogs and working in the harness, if you see a dog in harness with the handle raised, please do not distract these dogs. They could be at a really crucial part of their working when you go over and either say hello to them, touch them. We have people make noises or say good girl, good boy, anything like that will distract the dog from what it's doing. And at that point, it might be guiding its owner around a lamppost or doing something that could really put that owner in danger if it's distracted. So please don't distract our dogs.
We've also got some guide dog etiquette that will be on the training handout, so that'll come to you afterwards as well. So I'm going to hand back over to Matthew now.
Okay, thank you very much. We're now going to talk about establishing the needs of people with sight loss. We always say, don't we, that everybody is different, and people with sight loss are no exception. Everybody with sight loss is different. So this goes back to think, ask, act that we would refer to in some of our earlier training. Always ask, never assume. There are some particular things. When I walk into a church, quite often I'm told, oh, yes, we've got some large print. You'll find that very useful. Oh, and we'll put you at the front of the church because you'll find that very useful as well, won't you? Well, actually, I can't see anything. So large print isn't terribly useful. Braille perhaps would be more useful, but that's actually not the case for everybody. There are some people who might prefer the service by email. They might have already had contact with the church to get the service by email. They might ask you, next time could it be emailed, and then it's up to you to sort that out. Or pass it on to somebody who could sort it out. Or some people with tunnel vision might actually want small print. This is something that I found fascinating when I discovered it. But if you've got good central vision but no peripheral, actually you'd find it much easier to sort of zoom in on a very small piece of text and to sit at the back. I know people who can read signposts from miles away, but they can't actually see the signpost up close, and you just step back in order to see it. So be aware of that, and always make sure you ask, whereabouts do you want to sit? Would you like to sit at the front or the back, rather than just assuming they want to sit at the front? Some people with sight loss might prefer to sit at the end of a row. and it's a good idea to just ask them if that's something that they would like to do. This is so that they can get out a bit more easily, and if they've got a guide dog, it's particularly useful because it may be easier depending on the distance between two rows. It may be easier to accommodate a guide dog in the aisle rather than accommodating the guide dog, underneath the chair or something. And in that case, obviously, the person doesn't want to be separated from their dog, so they'd need to sit at the end of the row. Many people with sight loss like to be guided. This isn't something that we're going to spend a great deal of time on in this session. We'll probably have another session at some point that talks about guiding as its own thing, because there's so many things to be aware of. But generally, if they do want to be guided, they'll either want to hold your elbow or to hold onto your shoulder. What you don't want is for you to hold on to them. That is the worst thing you can do, because if you hold on to me, then you're in control of the situation. If I hold on to you, then I'm in control of the situation. And if for some reason I feel unsafe, which is not very likely, but if it does happen, then I'll be able to let go. Whereas if you're holding me, then I'm relying on you letting go, and you may not do that. Avoid guiding by the cane as well, by the way. That's really not very helpful. So, some would want to be guided. Others might prefer to follow. And others are happy just to be given some directions. That they might not be able to see the signs. So they might not actually know where to go. But once you've said, "Oh, just keep going straight and find an empty seat," then they'll be happy with that. So you should ask whether the person would like to be guided in the first place. And if they would like to be guided, check what side they want to be guided on. Because they'll have a preference, and particularly going back to guide dog etiquette, guide dogs tend to be trained to walk on the left-hand side of the person with sight loss. So if they did need to be guided, they'd need to be guided on the right-hand side, although the guide dog at that point may just want to follow. If a person would prefer to follow, ask whether they need you to verbalise directions. So does the person want you to say, "I'm turning left now," or "I'm turning right now"? Or is the person actually quite happy just to follow? Or is the guide dog, if the guide dog's following, then perhaps verbalising directions is not so necessary, but check whether that's something that the person wants. And when you verbalise directions, if that is something the person wants, make sure you do say left and right instead of, "Oh, it's over there, I'm just going over this way now," because that's not terribly useful. If you need to say left and right, use the rights and left of the person that you're talking to at all times. If for some reason you're facing the other way, the person isn't going to know that. So there's not much point in saying left when it's your left if it's actually the person's right, because the person will always go, left if you say left. So make sure you do that. And take the lead from the person with sight loss when you're setting the pace. I remember Becky, when we both started at Torch, was quite surprised at how fast I walk. Not all people with sight loss walk slowly, so just bear that in mind. If it's not obvious, this is the time as well when you might want to announce where coats and other belongings should be stored. So if it's okay just to leave your coat on the back of your chair, you don't necessarily need to say that, although you could be polite and just say, "Oh, yes, you take your coat off, put it on the back of your chair," that's fine. If that's for some reason not appropriate, if you've got lots of people to fit into a church and you've got pews and you don't want people taking up the pew with their coat, you might just want to make it very clear that actually we don't want you to put your coat next to you. Could you put your coat under the pew? Or there's a cloakroom where you can put your coat or something, and just make it very obvious what's actually going on. Otherwise the person with sight loss may not follow the trend and you may wonder why. So with all that said, it's a good idea to have some spare capacity in the welcome team to make sure that if you're spending all that time guiding a blind person, that other people coming into the church don't feel like they've got a bit of a raw deal because there's nobody to welcome them. Have someone with the opposite gender on hand if you can. This is because if a blind person needs to be guided to the toilet, it's usually okay just to guide them to the toilet door and then let them explore the rest of the way. But if they actually need help in the toilet area themselves and you're not of their gender, then having somebody of the opposite gender is kind of essential. We have a guide on our website in the resources section of sightlossfriendlychurch.org.uk. It's called Practical Guiding Tips, and in addition to the session that will hopefully run later on in the year, that should give you much more information about that and many other aspects of guiding somebody. You should identify parts of the service where a person with sight loss might need further assistance, and then arrange for this to happen, and arrange it before the service starts. So, for example, if it's a communion service, ask whether the person with sight loss might need help coming forward for communion. And if the person says, yes, I would like that help, explain who's going to provide it. So, if it's not you, that's fine, but just explain, my colleague George, he's the church warden, he's going to come and help you for communion because I'm going to be busy, so that the person knows who to expect. And you should also ask whether the person is likely to need help at the end of the service, and again, ensure that that need is accommodated, and just be upfront about saying, well, yes, I'll come back and see you at the end, or so-and-so, the church warden or somebody else in the congregation or one of the other welcomers, whoever it happens to be, just announce, this is who's going to come, so the person knows what to expect. You should avoid asking people with sight loss how much they can see. It's not always a straightforward question to answer, especially for partially sighted people whose vision is often difficult to explain. It can sometimes be helpful to ask whether or not someone is totally blind. That's a fairly legitimate question, I think. Are you totally blind, or can you get partially sighted? But that should be the extent of the conversation, unless, of course, the person is very happy to talk, and some people are. Some people absolutely love to tell you how much they can see, and that they've got 12% vision in their left, and the last time they had an eye test it was 10%, so actually their vision's gone up slightly, and in their right eye they've got nothing at all, but maybe sometimes they can see a speck of light if the light's very bright. Sometimes they love to have that conversation, and in which case there's no harm in having it, but other times it can be very awkward, and different, people can have different moods, as everybody can. Maybe the person with sight loss is just having a bad day and doesn't want to spend all that time explaining how their vision works to yet another person. So, you should ask the minimum amount of information necessary, and actually the information that's important is what they need and not necessarily why they need it. It's also worth pointing out that the vision of partially sighted people can fluctuate in some cases. So sometimes this is for predictable reasons, like somebody might be night blind, so they might not have particularly good vision in the dark, or indeed they might be photophobic, so they might not like sunlight, for example, and they might prefer it in the dark. But at other times, it's seemingly random, or perhaps due to factors that are sort of environmental factors outside the person's control, or only just within their control. So, for example, tiredness. If they've had a bad night's sleep, they might not be able to see as well, or stress. And this is particularly important in a church context, because if you are walking into a building for the first time, you're likely to be quite stressed about that, and therefore potentially likely to be more blind, if you'll forgive me for using that very direct expression. So if somebody does look like they get more sighted after they've been in the church for a few weeks, it might actually be the case that they've got less stressed because they've got more relaxed in the environment, and therefore some of that vision, stress-related vision loss, goes away. We'll have another pause for questions in just a moment. Before that, I'm going to turn back over to Becky to talk about making people feel welcome.
There we go. So we're going to be thinking about making people with sight loss feel welcome. So one thing that you might want to do is encourage a friendly member of the congregation to sit next to someone with sight loss if they're on their own. However, you do need to be aware about the person and their own needs and how they've responded to help. So if a person with sight loss has been very proactive about asking for help and is very keen to accept it when offered, then that is probably going to work really well to have someone sit next to them and indicate that they are willing to help during the service. If that person has been more reluctant, and maybe hasn't wanted to accept that help, then it might be just a good idea to have somebody sit next to them as a friendly person to sit with them during the service. There are a few things that somebody could practically do during sort of before and during the service and then immediately afterwards. I'm just going to share a slide again for you. So one practical thing could be pointing out items that might be of interest on the notice sheet. You don't need to read the entire notice sheet to somebody, but there might be some highlights that you might want to point out to them. And it may be that actually they've asked you some questions about things on the notice sheet that you can talk to them about. You might want to describe the key visual messages in videos or slides where there is no spoken content, or where the spoken content does not necessarily convey the same message as is on a slide or in a video. This might be true during the sermon or when notices are being talked about. So yeah, being aware of what's being displayed and making that person aware is always useful to do. You also might want to describe facial expressions and body language where that is relevant, so of people that are at the front. And also you might want to explain particularly poignant or humorous visual incidents that happen during the service that somebody might not have picked up on or be aware of. Or they might be aware that people have laughed at something, but unless you can see what's happened, you wouldn't necessarily know what that was. So that's another good idea to point out to somebody. You probably should resist the urge to describe every feature of the building and the detailed garments that people are wearing at the front, those sort of things you don't need to do, basically. Unless somebody is particularly interested and is asking you questions about it, then obviously you can talk about the building and that sort of thing. So it's always useful to maybe give a short and high level description of something, and then follow that up with, depending on the conversation. So again, it's if somebody wants to bring up things and ask you questions, then obviously you answer them. But yeah, go on the lead of the person and see particularly what they are interested in and what they might want to know more about. So the final section is about including a person with sight loss during fellowship and after the service. So after the service, when you return to the person with sight loss, it's really important to remind them who you are, introduce yourself again, say your name, ask them again if they still require the help that they thought they would need at the beginning. The situation may have changed, so they may have realised during the service that they don't need that help after all, or they may have made friends with somebody else in the service who has also offered to help them. So just ask again what sort of help they might need. Do actively encourage them to stay for refreshments, whatever that might be. Use the phrase such as "we'd love you to stay" rather than "would you like to stay." This can be a particularly maybe difficult and vulnerable time for a person with sight loss, and they may feel by now that they feel like they've been a burden and that they've already put you to too much trouble. So yeah, do encourage them to stay in a positive way, but also equally don't keep asking them. So if they've made it clear that they would like to leave, then obviously then ask them if they need to be guided to the exit and how you can help them to leave. Try to remember, if you are guiding someone, if you guided them at the start when you first met them, try to remember the technique that they asked you to use, unless of course they tell you something different. But again, this demonstrates that you've really valued them and you've taken notice of them, and this is something that they will remember. And do of course remember the person may need assistance to find their coat or whatever they've brought with them, especially if that's been left on a different seat or something. So just make sure that they've got everything that they need as they leave. So I'm going to hand back over to Matthew now, who's going to be talking a bit more about refreshments.
Yes, and I'm going to, this is probably the most personal part of it for me. I'll probably go off script quite a lot here and talk about things that happen in my own church and things that have annoyed me and things that have worked well for me. So at coffee time, I think it's probably fair to say that it's usually, I hesitate to say best, pragmatic is what I've put in the notes, but it is usually best just to, find a seat for the person with sight loss, sit them down, and then get them a drink and bring it to them. I've discovered this after many years of sort of trial and error, that this is actually genuinely what is best and what is easier. There are health and safety hazards that go along with holding 2 hot drinks and having to guide a blind person at the same time around lots of moving people, lots of children running around, all this sort of thing. When I first encountered this situation as an adult, and they said, "Oh, go and sit down, I'll bring something to you," I felt like that was a bit of a get out sort of, it was too easy. I'm an independent adult and I really want to do things by myself. And so I would say, no, let me come with you, because it's not fair that you should have to, carry my cup as well as, yours. I really want to do this for myself, and I want to be independent, and, of course I should come up, And look, if somebody with sight loss genuinely wants to come up, there's very little you can do, and you should probably accommodate that need. But it's appropriate to, at that point, perhaps indicate that it would be easier for you. And rather than making them feel like, would you like to sit down and then I'll go and get you a drink, as though it's their decision. If you were instead to say something like, "Listen, it'd be much easier for me if I didn't have to guide you and hold 2 cups at the same time. So is there any chance I could sit you down first for my benefit rather than sitting down for your benefit?" And then that would make me feel a lot more comfortable about, well, it is a bit lazy, but the person would prefer it that way. And that's how I would get around that particular slight pastoral challenge there. Make sure you ask the person with sight loss what drink they would like. And it sounds very simple. Do you want tea or coffee? But point out anything that's out of the ordinary. So if there's somebody new to the church, if your church has locally manufactured coffee and you're new to the church, you're not necessarily going to know that. And it's something that might come up at the hatch for most people, but it wouldn't necessarily come up for someone with sight loss. So make sure you tell them stuff like that. That would change my opinion. I'm not a particular coffee drinker, so normally I would say, "Oh, I'll have a cup of tea, please." If I was told that there was, locally produced coffee, I might change my mind and have coffee instead on that one particular occasion, because there's something special about it. So be sure to mention, quirks like that. Or somebody who's a regular at the church, if somebody's brought cakes, you might want to just mention that cakes are available and just check, do they want one, and what sort of cakes are available and all of that sort of thing. Make sure that the person with sight loss is aware of the full range of refreshments. So that sort of covers cakes and things, but also if there's, more than tea and coffee, maybe there's orange juice available, make sure to point that out. And don't forget to ask whether they would like milk and sugar. It sounds very obvious, but people do, and I've definitely had it when I've been I've been sat down and somebody has been at the hatch getting my tea and coffee and suddenly remembered they haven't asked, and so they'll sort of bellow across the room and ask whether I want milk and sugar, and that's quite embarrassing. So try to avoid that if you can, by asking before you go up to the hatch. If the person with sight loss is new to the church, they're not going to have a clue who they want to sit with unless they happen to have made friends with somebody in the congregation by that point. So it's kind of the onus is on you to sit them with people who look friendly. If you were sighted, you'd sort of drift to somebody who looked fairly approachable. You've now got to make that judgment for them. Try to sit them with people, who are likely to be friendly and engage them in conversation. Otherwise, if the person's a regular, ask the person with sight loss whether there is anywhere in particular they'd like to sit, or anyone in particular they'd like to sit with. And don't be surprised if you most of the time get a non-committal answer to that question. I know I certainly don't really know who's stayed for coffee, and I don't know, who to sit with. And I don't know if I'm going to offend anybody by saying, well, actually, I want to sit with this person when actually another person's trying to attract my attention or something like that. So, I'm going to give a non-committal answer, but probably once or twice a year I might hear in the notice sheet that I'm supposed to talk to somebody about something. It's time to fill in your electoral roll form or something, and I need to talk to the electoral roll officer. So in that one case, in that sort of 2 out of 52 or whatever, I might say, actually I'd like to see Dave, or I'd like to see Keith or Sheila or Margaret or somebody. So keep asking, even though you can be pretty sure that most of the time the person is going to say, no, it doesn't matter, just a seat is fine. When you bring a drink to a person with sight loss, make sure they know where you've put it. If you've put the cup in their hands, that's fine. Make sure they're aware of somewhere nearby where they can put the cup down, like a table. And if there isn't somewhere nearby, but there is table space available elsewhere, make that clear and say, look, there isn't a table here, but there is a table across the way. Don't insist that they go and sit at the table across the way, or don't sort of, make an assumption that they would like a table brought to them. Obviously make them aware. They might say at that point, yes, actually I'd quite like to go and sit at that table, but equally the number of times I've just put a cup down on the floor underneath the chair, and that's worked very well, and I haven't needed a table, and the person who I'm conversing with is more important than the table. If there's food available, and this is in things like bring and share lunches and things like that, it's usually not sufficient just to ask a person with sight loss what they would like and things like that. They're not likely to know either what's available and or in what quantities. So this is the most frustrating thing when I go to bring and share lunch and someone says, what do you want? And I say, well, I know what I'd like. I'd like a ham sandwich and some sausage rolls and a bit of salad. Okay, but I have no idea whether those are available. There might not be any ham sandwiches. So you've got to be that question is not particularly useful. Someone will then say, well, do you want, how many sausage rolls do you want? And I'll go, well, I'll have 5 of them then, please. And someone will say, yeah, but that's considering that there's only 20 sausage rolls on the plate. That's a little bit greedy. Look, I don't know. I need somebody to sort of make some good judgments on my behalf in those sorts of situations. So having established that the person with sight loss would actually like food in the first place, it can actually be easier to start by asking if there's anything particular that they don't want. And that gives me the opportunity to say, I don't want anything spicy, or what's available, because I'd really rather not have to have, like anything that needs a fork. And that would then give you an opportunity to sort of take the conversation forward in a slightly more constructive way. And you might decide at that point, if I turn around and say, well, I don't really want to use a fork, you've then at least got the option of saying, well, that's fine, but there's really nothing else available other than, stuff where you need a fork. And then at least that's given me a chance to sort of deal with it from that point on. Or, you might at that point need to give sort of a very high level overview of all the sandwiches, there's sausage rolls, there's crisps, there's salad, there's this, what do you want? And to determine portion sizes, it's usually best, unless it's come out in the conversation, unless it says, well, I like sausage rolls, but not that much, so, only 1 or so. Unless it's come out in the conversation, it's appropriate for you to make judgment and to ask about the portion size overall. If you were to say, would you like a small amount or a large amount or somewhere in the middle, the person can then make that judgment about how big their plate is going to be, and then you can work out, well, okay, they've got a big plate, the sandwiches aren't very popular, so we can have a lot of those, and the sausage rolls are very popular, so we can't have a lot of those, and go about it that way. If the person with sight loss has particularly fussy preferences, then okay, that is the point at which you might like to start to say, it would actually be easier if you came up and we went through it one by one and you said yes or no. But I think that's probably a minority of cases, but that would be an option at that point if you needed to. And then probably what you want to do is serve them first and then come back and serve yourself, or serve yourself first and then come back and serve them. that's basically all I've got to say, apart from one final point, which is just a general sort of point, really, that is, if you need to leave a person with sight loss, and it applies particularly after the service, but at any point, really, if you need to leave a person with sight loss, please tell them that you're leaving, so they're not talking to empty space. If it's not sort of come up in conversation already, the conversation may have just naturally ended, and it might be very obvious that, oh, well, I'm picking up my bag and I'm going to go because I've just had an emergency phone call or something, but if it's not obvious, then say something. And if at all possible, point out or introduce the person with sight loss to other people nearby who are staying put. So if you sit at a table and you're having a conversation, and it's generally a friendly table, but you're having a conversation with the person with sight loss, so they've not had the opportunity to meet other people on the table, it might just be a nice thing to say, look, I'm going to go, but this is Jenny. Jenny's on the table. She'll look after you, and she's interested in such and such and such. So you'll probably get on very well, or just something like that. You don't need to be painfully obvious about it, but equally, you don't want to say nothing either. So that is all that we've got for that training session. That's all we've got in the formal part of the presentation. I'm just looking in the chat and I haven't had any questions come in.
I have.
You have, okay.
So let me go through these with you. The first one is, if you had to evacuate a room, would you get the partially sighted person out first to prevent them panicking? Or is equally the blind person as well?
It's a very good question. The key in that situation would be to get to them. Not necessarily to get them out, I wouldn't say, but to get to them as quickly as possible. Yes, I suppose in a way get them out first, but if nothing else, get to them and say, yes, I know the alarm's going off, we're just waiting in the queue to get out of the building or something. But yes, absolutely, make sure that they've got help, and or notice what's going on. If somebody else in the congregation has dealt with the person with sight loss, then acknowledge that, and go on about your business. But yes, I wouldn't say get them out necessarily, although that would be a nice thing to do, but at the very least, make sure that there's somebody with them to keep that situation under control.
Brilliant. I've also had another one. So Diana has said, my friend who is totally blind finds it easier if the cup is not totally full. Is that universally helpful?
I mean, it probably is. It probably is universally true. I just quite like a big cup of tea, so I would prefer the cup to be full. I mean, I'd find it easier if it wasn't, but I'll prioritise my need for tea over the ease of use of the cup. But yeah, I mean, it's possibly worth considering that. I mean, I wouldn't fill it, right to the brim. Maybe leave a tiny bit of space at the top. And something that I find particularly daunting is when a cup is right on the edge. So if you're going to put a cup down on the table, I'd want that cup put a good sort of 5 or 10 centimetres or so into the table, if at all possible, so that I'm not likely to sort of put my hand forward and knock the cup over or knock the cup off a corner or something. To me, that's sort of slightly more important than whether the cup's full or not.
Brilliant, Matthew, thank you. And I think that's all. I think Susan might have started to write something, so I don't know if Susan has got a question.
Okay, well.
Hi, Susan. Let me unmute you.
I was just going to say I'll let people unmute themselves. The recording is still going at this point, so just be aware that if you do ask a question at this point, you'll be recorded. But people can now unmute and ask questions if they want to.
Hi, Susan. You are unmuted, Susan. So.
Thank you. Just not a question, really, just a comment. I'm a church member. I'm also a church steward, and I use a white cane with red banding. I do have got quite restrictive field of vision. And just to say to people that when you're approaching somebody with a visual problem, not to stand too close to them, because sort of invading their personal space, and it's most off-putting if someone's got their face right up to you. And also, because I wear hearing aids and can't see to the side, if people talk to me and I don't answer them, they think I'm being really ignorant. But just a comment. Thank you.
No, I appreciate you making that comment. Thank you. And that actually goes back on something that we said earlier on about using names. To me, it's actually quite important that not only do you introduce yourself, but also if you know my name, use it. If you're coming back to talk to me after an absence, if you don't say, hello Matthew or something, I'm not going to know whether you're talking to me or whether you're talking to the person in front or the person behind or the person to the left or the person to the right. So I'm likely to ignore you in that sort of situation as well, in case by not ignoring you I make an embarrassing mistake and interrupt a conversation that's not mine.
Absolutely. Does anyone else have anything they want to ask at this point? Trying to flick through in case I can see any waving hands. I don't think I can. No. Oh, there we go. Richard. Just spotted you. Oh, hold on. Let me unmute. You have to unmute. There you go.
Okay, right. It was very interesting. This is the first time I've joined. Our verger came to a previous meeting, but then asked me to join. Most of what we said is I think is very self-explanatory. And however, my question, as we at St Paul's are new into this, most of the points today, I believe, have been addressed at new people attending our church. And again, please apologise if you covered this at the last meeting. How important and how would you suggest that we go about asking existing congregation members? I mean, I know for a fact in our church, now that the subject has been raised, there are probably at least half a dozen people with an issue of in one way or another. But how important is it that we totally address the existing congregation's needs, or should we, once we've announced that we are a site-friendly lost church, do we leave people to approach those of us who are running this little project?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and there's not really a universal answer to it because, I mean,
no, sure.
you know the people who you think have got some degree of sight loss, and it's sort of, you'll know more about them than we do. But yes, if somebody's really struggling and really, really wants help, they will come and talk to you about it. So what you're left with is people who either are not struggling as much as you think they are, or more likely are struggling perhaps more than you think they are, but just are too proud or too embarrassed or too something to come up and talk to you. And
yes.
and this is something that probably needs to be addressed fairly sensitively. There was a very brief section, and perhaps I should have elaborated more on it in the training earlier on. I'm just trying to think what section it was in. I'll have a look. There's a handout coming out with this training, and there is something in there about it.
Okay.
It was in the section on strategies for identifying people with sight loss, just at the bottom of that section.
Right.
Looking out for people who are walking slowly or tentatively, and so on and so on.
Yes.
The thing is, in that situation, you don't want to be saying, "Look, I'm really sorry that I haven't noticed that you've got sight loss. What can we do to help?" Because actually, they're not sorry that you haven't noticed. They're actually quite happy that you haven't noticed. So, you don't want to be apologetic about it. You don't want to be saying, "Oh, well, we should have known before and we didn't." If they wanted you to know, they'd have told you. It's more about saying, "We've now noticed that this has come about," and quite often very, very discreetly, and it probably wants to come ideally from somebody who they know and somebody who they know well. Or somebody somebody with some sort of authority to say very gently and very quietly, look, we noticed last week that you had your hymn book upside down. We're wondering whether a large print version might be better for you, or something, or something along those lines, and be very diplomatic and make them aware that yes, you've noticed, and no, it's not a problem, and leave it at that, and don't apologise for not noticing sooner.
Mm-hmm. I think the current plan at the moment, with Vickers and PCC's approval, is that probably towards the end of the month, at the end of the service, there will be an announcement that we are now a member of the Sight Loss Friendly Church, and just advising people what it is, and then put it in notices, and generally just asking people with any concerns to come forward.
Yeah, and that's good, because what that will hopefully pick up are two things. First of all, it'll pick up people who have been too embarrassed to say something up until now, but who now go, well, I'll give it a shot, what have I got to lose? And it will also pick up people in the congregation around them who may have noticed something that you haven't, who might go and say, well, I've sat next to Margaret and she's got very frail recently, and I'm sure there might be some sight loss going on. And then it goes back to what I was saying before about being very diplomatic about how you actually approach it from then on.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
No problem. Thanks everybody for coming today. I really appreciate you coming, and hopefully you've found the session useful.
To find out more about Sight Loss Friendly Church, please get in touch. Telephone 01858 438 260. Email slfc@torchtrust.org, or visit the website sightlossfriendlychurch.org.uk.